evening and welcome to NTD News. I'm Stephania Cox. Here are today's top stories. The latest virus aid relief bill doesn't make it out of the Senate. Republicans and Democrats blame each other. The bill was less expensive than previous proposals. Over the weekend, a staff member for a top Democratic official was arrested during the riots in Portland. She was arrested for interfering with a police officer. Oregon's fires continue to blaze for the third day straight. Air conditions remain unstable and are complicating response efforts. Governor Kate Brown has requested federal aid to help manage the fire. A new report by the National Association of Scholars reveals how the Chinese regime has been working to infiltrate U.S. schools. It's been happening for nearly 2 decades, and students from kindergarten through college have been affected. And plagiarism seems to be running rampant in China. Netizens say Communist Party leader Xi Jinping's latest speech sounds a little too much like a famous Hong Kong protester's slogan. The Senate's latest attempt to advance a CCP virus aid bill came up short in voting. The 52-47 result is short of the needed 60 votes.
Democrat and Republican Party leaders were not happy with each other about yet another delay to the latest funding bill.
Senators who share the Democratic leaders' toxic attitude, who think the real enemy are their political opponents, I assume will follow his lead and vote no. They can tell American families they care more about politics than helping them.
Schumer says it's Republicans' fault a bill hasn't passed yet.
This bill is not going to happen because it is so emaciated, so filled with poison pills, so partisanly designed. It was designed to fail.
The latest $500 billion bill includes money for school reopenings, jobless benefits, and virus vaccines. Lawmakers will next vote to avoid a government shutdown. It could mean CCP virus aid funding will need to wait until a post-election lame duck session.
A Democratic staff member of Oregon's legislature has been arrested during Portland's ongoing riots. A total of 59 people were arrested over the weekend, and 43 people were processed by the Portland Police Bureau.
Christina Narayan, a legislative director for Democratic House Speaker Tina Kotek, was arrested for interfering with a peace officer. 58 others were also arrested during the riot, which spanned from the night of September 5th till the next morning. Police reports say multiple firebombs, mortars, rocks, and other items were thrown at law enforcement during the riot. The mayhem led to nearly 150 emergency calls being placed on hold at one point around 2 a.m. According to Narayan's LinkedIn page, the 29-year-old has been working for House Speaker Kotek since September of 2016 and became her legislative director in 2018. On September 1st, the Oregon House Speaker posted on Twitter saying people should be held responsible for destructive, dangerous, and violent acts, regardless of their jobs or their politics. She also said the protests will end when we see more change. Despite Narayan's arrest, her charge will likely be dropped. Multnomah County's District Attorney Mike Schmidt recently announced the prosecutor's office will not prosecute cases of disorderly conduct, criminal trespassing, and interfering with law enforcement officers. Schmidt claimed the unusual move would lead to a safer community.
Portland's Mayor Ted Wheeler is directing the Portland Police to end the use of CS gas for crowd control, effective immediately. And amidst the extreme tension between rioters and law enforcement in Portland, Oregon, a volunteer group of do-gooders is continuing its efforts to prevent violent crimes and serve the community. But one of their leaders said the recent clashes have made the job more difficult.
Back in the 80s, the volunteer organization known as the Guardian Angels was formed to stop violent crimes from being committed in New York City subways. The group now has members patrolling in communities across the U.S. and abroad. In Portland, Oregon, Guardian Angels walked along the streets and through a park to find a missing 15-year-old.
This is Benjamin. We're asking that he call home or he get in touch with somebody that knows that he's safe. His mom's worried about him. Hasn't heard from him, hasn't seen him. So we're going to help her find her son.
The Portland Guardian Angels also turned their attention to the riots and protests taking place in the city.
And our main focus down here is obviously you can't stop a crowd of 300 people, but what you can do is when you see someone in distress or afraid and they're trying to get out of the riot or the protest, we offer them to escort them out. We'll get them on public transportation, or we'll drive them home.
According to the Portland Police Bureau, there were close to 500 shootings compared to nearly 300 from last year. Campos suspects that shooting victims will not be getting the help they need because the Portland police are too occupied with the riots.
The people that really need the help, the people that are being shot and killed, those officers are taking longer to respond. And could a life have been saved, but they weren't there to respond quicker. And those are conversations that we have to start asking them.
In June of this year, Portland Police Bureau's gun violence reduction team was disbanded. The local police leadership and union later said the unit should be brought back in response to the upsurge in gun-related crimes.
Oregon's Governor Kate Brown provided an update on the wildfires that are ravaging the state.
For the third day, fires in Oregon continue to burn across the state. In just 3 days as of September 10th, over 900,000 acres have burned, and between 30 and 40,000 people have evacuated the state. Typically, Oregon sees 500,000 acres of land burned in 1 year.
Today marks what we hope is the final day of the wind event that put us in this urgent fire situation.
Governor Brown went on to note that while the wind dynamics are changing, Oregon is facing unstable air conditions that make response efforts difficult and unpredictable. She said she hopes in the next day the state will see a shift from evacuation to firefighting and containment. Chief of Fire Protection Doug Grafe said his team were able to take the first step towards containment in 72 hours. They have started to contain almost 5% of the fires.
I want you to know that we are doing everything we can to fight these fires. We have tapped our Oregon National Guard members and are looking for additional capacity from surrounding states.
Governor Brown urges Oregonians to monitor the situation and evacuate quickly if they need to.
Oregon's governor issued a national emergency request for additional materials and secured strike teams from Utah to help out. She also sent a request to the U.S. Department of Defense for a battalion of active duty members trained in firefighting. And U.S. government has charged 50 more people from all over the U.S. for using Paycheck Protection Program loans to buy luxury items. A Department of Justice attorney held a news conference to announce the fraud charges.
The money these defendants stole was taxpayer money. Every dollar received was a dollar drawn from the American people's account. Even worse, every dollar they took was a dollar that we had all set aside to help our fellow Americans weather one of the worst national crises in recent history. PPP funds, as I mentioned earlier, were intended to help keep American businesses afloat. They were intended to help ordinary, everyday Americans pay their bills and put food on the table. I can assure you that they were not intended to help support fraudsters' dreams of owning Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royces, Range Rovers, or diamonds.
The new arrests mean the Justice Department has now prosecuted 57 people since the PPP program began. They've been able to recover or freeze more than $30 million in PPP funds. And the National Association of Scholars has released a new report. It lays out how the Chinese Communist Party has worked to strategically corrupt the U.S. education system since at least 2003. The author of the report and other scholars give us a deeper look at the problems. They were on a panel discussion with our sister media, the Epoch Times.
While more than 40 Confucius Institutes have already closed, the Chinese Communist Party has worked for more than a decade to burrow its way in to America's K-12 education system and distort the truth about the regime. Rochelle Peterson from the National Association of Scholars explains in her report that it starts with the College Board, which in her words is corrupted by the CCP from the inside out.
And through this network, the College Board encourages school districts to host Chinese government-selected teachers in K-12 classrooms, often in immersion classes in which Chinese teachers teach not only Chinese language, but also social studies, history, and other subjects the CCP takes a special interest in.
Peterson says the College Board is bought off by the CCP and has been for nearly 2 decades. The College Board also worked with the CCP to develop the AP Chinese Language and Culture course, which high school students can take to earn college credit. One professor says a major problem is that the Communist Party eradicates traditional Chinese culture and replaces it with Communist Party-approved narratives.
Whereas in the Cold War, we were very aware that we didn't want Stalinist literature for our students of Russian language. We wanted them to be reading the Russian classics. And for some reason, we think it's okay for literature and textbooks coming out of communist China to be normalized among our student population. So
Gilley emphasized that the enemy is the CCP rather than the Chinese people. He says that the Chinese people are our allies to recovering and preserving the authentic Chinese culture.
We need to develop alternatives, and we need to root out the pernicious influence of the CCP. We cannot let the next generation of Americans be trained by the Chinese Communist Party.
So how can U.S. citizens make an effort to push back against the CCP's encroachment? The scholars suggest a few approaches. Avoid participation in the CCP-backed AP Chinese courses and demand an alternative. Support the Athena Act, which calls to withhold taxpayer funds from colleges that have agreements with the CCP. The petition can be found on athena.org/legislation. And the full report from Rochelle Peterson can be found on nas.org. Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
The president refuted a claim that he misled the American people about the seriousness of the virus. He told a reporter who made this claim that the accusation was disgraceful. Trump said he did not lie, but that he made it clear the country needs to stay calm and not panic moving forward.
According to the president, over 10 million jobs have been created in the last 4 months in what is the smallest economic contraction of any Western nation amid the pandemic. That includes around 650,000 construction jobs being created. Trump said the country's labor market is experiencing the fastest recovery from any economic crisis in history. The president stated new weekly cases have declined by nearly half in the last 2 months, and deaths from the virus are down 20% compared to last week. In a Q&A session, Trump addressed journalist Bob Woodward's book, Rage, which discloses a series of phone calls he had with the president about 5 months ago. Trump annulled claims that he lied to the American people about the severity of the virus, saying the reporter who accused him of doing so was acting disgracefully.
And before any statement was made, you have to remember, I put the ban on China. So obviously, outwardly, I said, it's a very serious problem. And it's always a serious problem. That doesn't mean I'm going to jump up and down in the air and start saying, people are going to die, people are going to die. No, I'm not going to do that. We're going to get through this, and we're right now, I hope, really think we're rounding the final turn.
The president said he is taking a science-based approach to opening schools safely and keeping them open.
Based on the recent data from more than 20 colleges, not a single student who tested positive for the virus has been hospitalized. So that's a lot of people, that's a lot of students. Not one has been hospitalized.
Trump said there is no substitute for in-person learning. He cited a recent study that shows online learning has caused student progress in math to decrease by half compared to in-person learning. Kevin Hogan, NTD News.
Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden is promoting his new plan to bring jobs home. He was in Warren, Michigan on the campaign trail Wednesday, countering Trump's message of economic recovery.
Speaking from the parking lot of the United Auto Workers headquarters, Biden discussed his new campaign platform. His campaign is calling it his plan to ensure the future is made in America by all of America's workers.
His 2017 tax bill slashed taxes on companies that send production and jobs overseas. Those corporations then make huge profits by shipping these foreign-made products back to the United States to sell to American consumers.
Biden accused Trump of not keeping his promise to American workers. Biden also vowed to be the most friendly president to unions in the history of the U.S. Earlier that morning, Biden unveiled his plan to penalize companies for moving jobs out of the country and reward with a tax credit those that invest in the U.S. Michigan Republicans criticized Biden for pitching plans similar to Trump's Made in America campaign. The GOP accused Biden of bad trade deals that shipped millions of jobs to China due to his support of the North American Free Trade Agreement. While in Michigan, Biden also met with union steelworkers in Detroit. The visit was Biden's first to Michigan since becoming the Democratic nominee.
And this evening, the Trump campaign is set to touch down in Michigan, where the president will give a speech at a rally in Freeland. And coming up, indoor dining returns to New York City later this month. Besides more income, some restaurants are saying they can bring back more workers. And we speak with a first responder who helped evacuate people during 9/11. He tells us about his exhausting work and the rescue operations over those several weeks. That and more after the break. New Yorkers will be able to dine indoors once again by the end of the month. Some restaurant owners are saying this means more business and more jobs, but that it's long overdue. NTD's Miguel Moreno has more from Manhattan.
Outdoor dining was a success for restaurants compared to either closing down or takeout only, but indoor dining is making a comeback by the end of September. It's a decision from the governor some businesses say they were literally dying to hear.
And we're now announcing today that we can go to 25% of indoor dining with certain restrictions.
Besides potentially making more money, some restaurants are saying this means more people can come back to work.
A lot of people are still out of working, so that would be good to get these people back, because once we open inside, we'll need more staff.
According to the state's labor department, as of July, the city's unemployment rate was about 20%, with food businesses taking the biggest hit. The manager of this Italian restaurant told us he's happy with the news, but it's not enough.
When you get the indoor and the outdoor together, that'll be great. But once it gets cold outside, 25% inside is not going to do it.
Trusello also said he thinks the decision is long overdue, adding that a $2 billion class action lawsuit filed by restaurants against the city and state may have gotten the ball rolling. A few people told us they're looking forward to it as long as they can socially distance.
If everyone's wearing a mask, and it's enough social distance, I'm definitely going to eat at some places I've been missing.
From outside, look in and see that, it seems like they're spacing people out, socially distancing, and, their staff are adhering to masks, gloves, and stuff like that. I would consider going in and sitting down. Yeah.
The governor says restaurants will have to follow strict regulations like temperature testing everyone coming in and collecting contact information for contact tracing purposes. Miguel Moreno, NTD News, New York.
Governor Cuomo says if the infection rate stays relatively low, he may give restaurants permission to open up at 50% capacity in November. And New York City is preparing to pay tribute to the lives lost on 9/11. This Friday, a ceremony at Ground Zero will mark the 19th anniversary of the terror attacks. The biggest change is that this year there will be no live reading of the victims' names. Instead, organizers will play recordings of family members reading the names. Those in attendance are also expected to adhere to state and federal guidelines regarding social distancing. The ceremony will honor the 2,983 men, women, and children killed in the attacks at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and aboard Flight 93. And on that day, nearly 19 years ago, an NYPD recruit answered the call to help people evacuate Lower Manhattan. Our reporter, Kevin Hogan, has more on the first responders' operations.
Almost a generation has passed since that fateful day when terrorists hijacked planes and destroyed the Twin Towers, killing thousands of innocent Americans in just a few hours. Paul Grattan was a recruit at the NYPD Police Academy who was stationed in Brooklyn at the time. He was dispatched to the Brooklyn side of the Manhattan Bridge that morning to help people escape from a noxious cloud of dust and debris. Tens of thousands of people evacuated Manhattan by that bridge that morning. Many were covered in dust and smoke, some were injured, some just came out of the rubble, others had trouble breathing, and many had trouble walking and needed medical help. Grattan did his best to help people cross the bridge and call for medical support, but there was only so much he could do.
Despite our best resources and best efforts, there was simply not enough first responders in the early hours of this incident. This is where you really saw New York come together. This is where you really saw how resilient New York is from the very first moments, people helping each other out.
NYPD and firefighters risked their lives to save people from the buildings and from the rubble afterwards. Nearly half of all the New York City firefighters that died since its founding died on September 11th. 23 police officers died on that day, and hundreds of first responders died years later due to illnesses from the poisonous smoke. Grattan, who is now a sergeant, still has his NYPD hat that is covered in dust. In the weeks following the attack, Grattan assisted in the recovery and security operations.
At the time, we were completely exhausted. These were days when we were working 16 hours a day, very little sleep, things like that. I do recall that on the night of 9/11, I had about a 2.5-hour turnaround from being dismissed from our first shift, so to speak, to having to come back in to report in Midtown Manhattan at 4 in the morning for the next shift.
The brave men and women in uniform saved the lives of many helpless individuals during the crisis on 9/11. Yet recently, a handful of high-profile deaths involving police has started a movement to defund the police. This has resulted in New York City cutting $1 billion from its police department, while protesters and a columnist for the New York Times are calling for the complete abolition of police.
You need to be a little careful of what's read maybe in some of the newspapers and what's on the news being used as more of a political tool than anything else. I think by and large the opinion of most Americans is very pro-police and understanding of the fact that we need law enforcement to maintain law and order.
A poll by the independent research organization, the Democracy Institute, shows that 3/4 of Americans do not support defunding their local police department, compared to 16% who do. And residents around the country have shown their support for law enforcement by marching alongside them.
When you see the resilience of New Yorkers, New York's first responder community, New York City's residents, and the residents across this country, and how resilient they are, and how they lift each other up and come to each other's aid during critical times like 9/11, then you really start to understand that the true goals of terrorism will always fail.
During Friday night's Tribute in Light, the city will honor the fallen and celebrate the unbreakable spirit of New York. Kevin Hogan, NTD News, New York.
Still to come, plagiarism seems to be running rampant in China. Netizens are noticing striking similarities between Xi Jinping's latest speech and a famous Hong Kong protester's slogan. And censorship isn't the only way for Chinese regime to manipulate public opinion. An internal document reveals how authorities detract attention from negative publicity. That and more after the break. A hot topic has sparked among Chinese netizens: plagiarism. That's after some pointed out that a speech by Chinese leader Xi Jinping sounds familiar, similar to a famous Hong Kong protester's slogan. NTD's Tiffany Meyer brings us more.
Hundreds of thousands of people have succumbed to the CCP virus worldwide. Chinese authorities continue to cover up the pandemic's real situation inside the country's borders. But on Tuesday, the regime held a national anti-epidemic commendation conference in Beijing. During the ceremony, medical staff and other frontline workers were praised. It appears to have been an attempt to convince the outside world that the communist regime was successful in its fight against the virus. The ceremony celebrated certain individuals, all of which complied with the CCP's false narrative. But whistleblowers who sought to expose the truth, like Dr. Li Wenliang, didn't receive a single mention. During the conference, one speech in particular caught the public's eye. The head of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, remarked that there are no heroes who fall from heaven, only mortals who step forward. His words were likely meant to praise the country's young people for their efforts to quell the initial outbreak. But his statement caused a surprising stir instead. Hong Kong netizens immediately condemned Xi for plagiarizing one of Hong Kong's most famous slogans, used by the city's pro-democracy movement. The slogan was once written on the buildings of 2 Hong Kong universities, encouraging students to fight the police suppression of campus morale. The slogan originates from Marco Lee, a former Hong Kong protester who now lives overseas. After hearing the news, Li wrote a post condemning the regime's use of his words. Using social media, he shared a statement saying, "The most despicable and evil organization on earth destroyed my hometown, imprisoned and killed my people, forced my family into exile, and then misappropriated what little spirit I had left in Hong Kong for a speech used to deceive victims of a biological weapon." U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo criticized Chinese state-run media mouthpieces, calling Beijing's propaganda system hypocritical. This after China's propaganda mouthpiece People's Daily refused to run an op-ed by the U.S. ambassador to China, Terry Branstad. The op-ed called for more positive relations between the two countries through unrestricted engagement and uncensored discussion. Pompeo said the People's Daily's response once again exposes the Chinese Communist Party's fear of free speech and serious intellectual debate, as well as Beijing's hypocrisy when it complains about lack of fair and reciprocal treatment in other countries. Pompeo added that Chinese officials enjoy the freedom of expression in the U.S., and China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and state-run media regularly attack U.S. policies on U.S. social media. The refusal by the People's Daily follows a U.S. decision this week to revoke more than 1,000 visas of Chinese nationals. The U.S. ambassador to China's op-ed called out the Chinese regime, saying it has exploited U.S. openness. He said while U.S. journalists face restrictions on reporting and even entering China, Chinese state media workers have long enjoyed open access in the United States. Branstad calls for reciprocity so that the two countries can achieve a genuinely balanced relationship. The People's Daily said in their response the U.S. envoy's op-ed failed to meet their standards and that his piece was full of loopholes. Pompeo, meanwhile, said the Chinese regime must respect freedom of speech, saying their refusal to do so shows just how much China's unelected party elites fear their own people's free thinking and the free world's judgment about their governance practices inside China.
In northern China, over 100 people from the same village are on the wanted list. An internal document obtained by NTD reveals how local authorities distracted public opinion. NTD's Juliet Song has more on that.
An internal document reviews how Chinese authorities manipulate public opinion. In 2016, Chinese police increased the crackdown on telecom fraud. On their wanted list were over 100 people from the same place, a county in China's central Henan province. The news generated a buzz in society, and the negative publicity alarmed local officials. To sway public opinion, they came up with a solution. NTD obtained an internal document that detailed the plan. It said to guide public opinion on the internet, local authorities decided to set up an influential internet campaign filled with positive energy. The Chinese regime often uses the word positive energy in its propaganda. It means to only focus on the bright side of things. In contrast, the regime considers crises and disasters as negative energy. For local officials, suppressing negative news becomes part of their job as it affects their political performance.
They need to create a so-called harmony in society, an illusion that negative events don't exist. The harmony is part of the local officials' political achievements, and it helps with their future promotion.
The authorities planned a publicity event where they would give money to people that are over 100 years old. To make the event a hot topic in the news, local authorities deployed their internet army. According to the document, they hired 1,500 online commentators. Within 48 hours, the commentators forwarded related news articles over 1,000 times. They also left comments under the news articles and set up posts on online forums. Local authorities seemed to be happy with the result. They cited this as a successful case in their annual work review and said the publicity effort generated massive influence online and successfully turned around public opinion. Juliet Song, NTD News.
Up next, U.S. officials seize thousands of fake Apple products from China, including earphones and charging cables. And a new retailer joins the list of companies forced to close their doors because of the pandemic. Discount fashion retailer Century 21 is filing for bankruptcy and closing all remaining stores. U.S. Customs officials seized more than 16,000 fake Apple products in a recent shipment from China. 14% of the items were counterfeit wireless earphones. The rest were fake charging cables. If authentic, the items would have been valued at over $650,000. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, discovered the counterfeit items in July while checking arriving shipments in Los Angeles. Of all the seizures last year, nearly half originated from China. CBP warns that buying fake electrical goods is dangerous because they don't go through rigorous safety testing. And signs that Huawei is shrinking in Europe. A French telecom company this month saying it is not authorized to use Huawei in its 5G networks. One expert says the Chinese tech giant is facing an ominous situation. Our France correspondent David Vives has the details.
Things seem to only be taking a turn for the worse for Huawei in Europe. French telecom company Free Mobile said on September 3rd that French authorities forbade them from using Huawei in its 5G network. This announcement comes after the French cybersecurity agency, ANSSI, said French telecom companies would have a temporary permit to use Huawei's 5G technology. ANSSI head Guillaume Poupard said in July that, quote, "What I can say is that there won't be a total ban, but for operators that are not currently using Huawei, we are advising them not to go for it."
The U.S. has urged its allies to ban Huawei from their 5G networks, and the U.K. has committed to phase out the Chinese company from its 5G networks. But President Emmanuel Macron's stance is unclear. Last month, he said he is not excluding Huawei, but favors European providers. However, his position is aligning more and more with those of President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
In France, telecom company Bouygues decided on August 28th this year to remove Huawei from its core network. This will result in 3,000 antennas being dismantled across France by 2028. According to Associate Director at Counterpoint Research Jan Styrjak, Huawei's future in Europe is likely to come to a dead end.
As we know, across Europe, a growing list of carriers are removing Huawei from their core networks. UK's gone even further and banned Huawei altogether from the RAN as well. So that basically means that Huawei's core networks kind of it's like a question of when, not if, they're going to be removed altogether.
Moreover, Huawei faces a considerable delay manufacturing new chips due to U.S. sanctions against the company. And they've also been hit by a decrease in sales of their smartphones. In the words of Styrjak, the virus has impacted all smartphone sales. Despite signs of recovery, Huawei is shrinking in a shrinking market.
So Huawei's going to face more competition in terms of their RAN. They're being expelled from core networks, and then their consumer business is in trouble as well. So, essentially they're being attacked from all angles, and it's looking pretty ominous.
According to internal sources quoted by the webzine 01net in France, the revenue of the Chinese company dropped by 31% in the first 6 months of 2020. The author questioned if these are the first signs of Huawei's near end in the country. Reporting by David Vives, NTD News.
Discount clothing store Century 21 is filing for bankruptcy. Century 21 has 13 stores, mostly in New York City and the surrounding metropolitan area. The business says it will shut down all of its stores. 1,400 employees will be affected. Clothing stores have been hit particularly hard. Millions of people don't need to buy many dress clothes since they're out of work or working from home. Century 21 said the final straw was the fact that it did not get $175 million it had filed for under its business interruption insurance. Larger national department store chains like JCPenney, Neiman Marcus, and Lord & Taylor have also filed for bankruptcy, and Lord & Taylor announced plans to shut down permanently. And there are a record number of empty apartments in New York City, and the number is rising. The author of a new report says it'll be months before things get better. NTD's Phil Zoe reports.
A new report by Douglas Elliman Real Estate and appraiser Miller Samuel shows there is a record supply of empty apartments for rent in New York City right now.
This has been it's been a record month of records.
There were 15,000 empty apartments in Manhattan alone in August, the most in 14 years. That's nearly triple the amount from the same time last year. Miller Samuel CEO told us the vacancy rate is also the highest it's ever been, more than double the normal range.
not only is it a record, but it's the first time exceeding 5%. Last month was the first time exceeding 4%. The month before was the first time exceeding 3%.
Miller says renters are flocking to the suburbs to rent single-family houses. Those who can afford to purchase are also buying.
A surge in contract activity in the suburban markets that surround New York, and many of these are first-time buyers that are coming from Manhattan.
Miller expects the weakening rental market to last well into the fall season. Phil Zhou, NTD News, New York.
Up next, the EU has issued an ultimatum to the UK, requesting the UK scrap some parts of a controversial bill, or the EU will take legal action. Who will be the first to blink? And after the discovery of a box under a fountain, people in a Belgian city can finally believe how wholeheartedly a mayor of 200 years ago loved the city. More on these after the break. Over to Europe. After more than 4 years and at the cost of 3 prime ministers, Brexit is now facing another dramatic turn. Again, it's about Northern Ireland. NTD UK's Neil Woodrow will bring us more news from Europe.
Thanks. Welcome to the UK newsroom, bringing you UK and European news. The European Union is threatening legal action over a bill proposed by the UK government.
European Commission Vice President Maros Šefčovič is holding emergency talks in London over the internal market bill. He says the bill seriously damages trust between the EU and the UK. He's calling on the UK government to withdraw these measures from the draft bill in the shortest time possible and in any case by the end of the month. On the other side, UK Cabinet Minister Michael Gove made it clear the UK will not withdraw the bill and admitted it will break international law.
One of the reasons for making sure that we can proceed with the UK internal market bill is that businesses have told us that they would prefer to have certainty at the end of the transition period on how the UK internal market will operate.
The dispute centres on rules for Northern Ireland, which shares a land border with the EU member Ireland. An element of the divorce deal prevents a hard border from returning to the island of Ireland. The internal market bill would change that and give UK ministers the power to modify or disapply rules on goods travelling between Northern Ireland and the UK.
The London extradition hearing for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is postponed. Assange is wanted in the US for conspiring to hack government computers and releasing confidential cables in 2010 and 2011. The judge adjourned the case until Monday after being told a lawyer representing the US might have been exposed to the virus. Assange's lawyer argued he should be granted bail because of his health, but the judge denied the request, calling Assange a flight risk, having skipped bail once in 2012. The Minsk headquarters of a jailed Belarusian opposition politician was raided by masked men. Footage released by Viktor Barbarico's press service shows over 20 men forcing open the door. They wore caps and masks and covered the camera. Barbarico, a banker, and other opposition figures were forming a new political party when he was arrested last month. Another arrested opposition politician, Maria Kolesnikova, says security officers put a bag over her head and threatened to kill her when they tried to deport her to Ukraine earlier this week. She is currently detained in Minsk. Kolesnikova is accused of illegally attempting to seize power. She is a prominent leader in the month-long protests against the re-election of President Alexander Lukashenko, dubbed the last dictator in Europe. And the European Parliament is no longer inviting Burmese leader Aung San Suu Kyi to its Human Rights Prize events. Suu Kyi spent most of 21 years as a political prisoner in Burma, also known as Myanmar. She was released in 2010 and won a landslide victory in 2015, ending half a century of military rule. While a prisoner, she was awarded the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. EU lawmakers say she is excluded for failing to denounce a military campaign against Rohingya Muslims in Burma. French carmaker Citroën is launching a new microcar, hoping it will reach an untapped market.
At less than 8 feet long and 5 feet wide, with plastic bodywork, the Citroën Ami is hoping to appeal to a new generation. The two-seat vehicle is fully electric and can reach a top speed of 27 miles per hour.
It is nice. I think it is a small enough model to travel in the city because of the traffic jams, and I'm in favor of electric because it is less polluting.
Because of Ami's modest-sized electric motor, it's classified as a quadricycle in France. meaning it can be driven without a driver's license by anyone above 14. It's on sale alongside smartphones and video games in a major French electronics store chain.
Today we are surprised by the number of sales, as it is above what we thought, because we've already had more than 1,000 sold.
Prices for a Mi start at just over $7,000. It can also be leased for less than $23 a month.
And an urban myth becomes reality after discovery under a fountain in Belgium.
For years it was just fiction mentioned in civic documents, until renovation work began on Vervier's ornate stone fountain last month.
During the work on the David fountain, we had the great privilege and the great luck to find a small box which contains the heart of the former mayor, Pierre David. Official text mentioned the presence of this box, but no one really believed it.
Pierre David was Vervier's first mayor after Belgium became an independent country. He died while still in office in 1839 after falling from a building. Authorities built a fountain in his honor and, with his family's permission, buried his heart under a stone in the monument in 1883.
I don't know of any other examples. For me, he is the only mayor for whom such a thing happened.
The metal box containing David's heart is on display at the Verviers Museum of Fine Arts and Ceramics. It will be returned to the fountain once the renovation is complete.
That's all from us for now. Thanks for watching. Back to New York.
Thanks, Neil. And people in the Lebanese capital of Beirut are still traumatized from the explosion. Now they are dealing with yet another problem. A huge fire broke out in the very area where the blast took place.
The Lebanese president said the fire might have been the result of sabotage, a technical error, or negligence. He added that the cause should be found out soon and the perpetrators have to be held accountable. The fire erupted around 1 p.m. local time and continued for hours. It engulfed parts of the devastated Lebanese capital in a pall of smoke. The blaze began in the shattered duty-free zone of the port. It prompted some residents to flee the city. They are still traumatized by last month's explosion. Army helicopters dropped water as firefighters battled on the ground to bring the blaze under control. By evening, most flames had been extinguished. Smoke still rose from smoldering wreckage, but it was far less dense. One of the warehouses that was on fire stored aid packages for the International Committee of the Red Cross. The organization's Middle East director said that the fire put their humanitarian operations at risk to be seriously disrupted.
Up next, due to the pandemic, New York Fashion Week will look a little different this season. The whole event will be shorter, and most of the catwalk excitement will be online instead. And a rare diamond, barely bigger than a lollipop, is going on auction in Hong Kong. It's expected to be sold for up to $30 million. More on that when we return. New York Fashion Week will look a little different this season. That's due to the virus restrictions, which are altering nearly every facet of life.
Normally, the New York Fashion Week takes place in a 7-day parade of runway shows, presentations, and events. This year, they have been stripped down to 5 days and will be held from September 13th to 17th. IMG is the organization that hosts the New York Fashion Week. They worked closely with the mayor's office and the restrictions in order for the shows to take place.
We evolved the event and our offerings to designers to be able to create an event that's both safe and successful for designers.
Usually the Fashion Week is held at Spring Studios, but the location will be used in a different way this season. The studio's rooftop will be given to designers for runway shows. Those will have a very small socially distant audience. The indoor venues where the big runway shows are usually held will be used for content creation. Films and social media content will be produced that portray collections in new and different ways. The videos will then be broadcast on nyfw.com. A Brooklyn-based model has been working in London since March. She described the few shows she has done during the pandemic as very strange.
And so backstage there can be like at least 100 people in one room for the hair and makeup. And now it's like dwindling. Like there'll be like less than a dozen.
She added that she hopes the fashion shows will go back to how they used to be, but she says she thinks it's going to take a while before it's the same fashion week people are used to.
One of the world's rarest diamonds is going up for auction next month. It's about the size of a lollipop and is expected to be sold for up to $30 million.
The rare diamond will be sold at Sotheby's auction in Hong Kong. Sotheby's said the flawless white sparkler, which is over 100 carats, is the second largest oval diamond of its kind to be offered at auction. The largest was an almost 120-carat diamond. It was sold for a record-setting $30 million in Hong Kong in 2013.
We're looking at an exceptional diamond. It's 102.39 carats, D color, which is the best color that you can possibly have, flawless clarity, which means there's not a single inclusion or blemish on the diamond.
Only 7 diamonds of this kind that are over 100 carats have ever been sold at an auction. The diamond will be sold in a single lot auction without a reserve price at Sotheby's in Hong Kong on October 5th. It's the first time in Sotheby's history that they're offering this diamond without an estimate.
And we are truly letting the market decide. Historically, diamonds of this caliber and this size have sold in a range between $10 and $30 million. But for this particular stone, we'll just have to see.
The diamond was cut from an over 270-carat rough that was discovered at the Victor Mine in Ontario, Canada in 2018. Craftsmen cut and polished the stone for more than a year.
And that's all for today's news. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Stephanie Cox.
Censorship isn't the only way for the Chinese regime to manipulate public opinion. An internal document reveals how authorities distract attention away from negative publicity. The U.S. urged Southeast Asian nations to act together against China's dominance. Some of them are facing China's Communist Party in the South China Sea. Plagiarism is common for the CCP, and its head Xi Jinping even plagiarized one famous slogan from Hong Kong protesters. Is a Chinese vaccine more trustworthy than the imported ones? A Chinese expert tried to tell TV viewers the truth, but in a way that kept him out of trouble. And for Chinese tech giant Huawei, a shortage of chips is not the only problem it's facing. Things seem to also be taking a turn for the worse in Europe. Tune in at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time and tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time to watch the full China in Focus.